Story number 1, I work in IT for a mid-sized company, which means I spend most of my weekdays sitting in front of a computer screen troubleshooting network issues and answering help desk tickets. By Friday evening, I'm usually burned out and looking forward to doing something completely different on the weekends. I'm not much of a party person, so my idea of a perfect Saturday usually involves outdoor activities, hiking, maybe some photography, anything that gets me away from technology and into fresh air. This particular incident happened about 2 years ago during a weekend camping trip I'd planned to a state park about 3 hours north of where I live. I'd been looking forward to it for weeks, needing a break from work stress and city life. The park had primitive camping sites, meaning no electricity or running water, which was exactly what I wanted. Just me, a tent, some basic supplies, and a couple days of complete disconnection from phones, emails, and all the digital noise that fills my regular life. I arrived at the park on Friday afternoon, checked in with the ranger station, and drove out to campsite number 47, which was listed as being in a secluded area about 2 miles from the main camping loop. The site was perfect, surrounded by tall pine trees, with a fire ring and picnic table, and no other campers visible in any direction. I could hear a creek running somewhere nearby, and the only sounds were birds and wind through the trees. I spent Friday evening setting up my camp, gathering firewood, and just enjoying the solitude. I made a simple dinner over the fire, read for a while by flashlight, and went to sleep early. It was exactly the kind of peaceful, restorative experience I'd been hoping for. No cell phone service, no internet, no work emails, just quiet and darkness and the sound of the creek. Saturday morning, I woke up around 7 a.m. feeling more rested than I had in months. I made coffee over the camp stove, ate some trail mix and fruit, and planned my day. The park had several hiking trails, and I wanted to explore at least 2 of them before the afternoon got too hot. I packed a day pack with water, snacks, my camera, and a map, and set out for what I expected to be a relaxing day of hiking and photography. The first trail was about a 4-mile loop that took me through mixed forest and along a ridge with decent views of the surrounding countryside. I saw a few other hikers, exchanged the usual friendly greetings, and took probably 50 photos of interesting trees, rock formations, and wildlife. It was exactly the kind of day I'd been hoping for: peaceful, physically active, and completely removed from my usual routine. I got back to my campsite around 1 p.m., made lunch, and rested for an hour before deciding to tackle the second trail I'd planned to explore. This one was longer, about 6 miles, and led to a small waterfall that the park brochure described as particularly scenic. The trailhead was about 1 mile from my campsite, accessible by a dirt road that also served some of the more remote camping areas. The second hike started out just as enjoyable as the first. The trail was well marked and not too challenging, winding through dense forest and crossing the creek several times on small wooden bridges. I was making good time and looking forward to reaching the waterfall, which according to the trail markers was about 3 miles in. About 2 miles into the hike, I started hearing sounds that didn't seem to fit the forest environment. At first, I thought it might be other hikers, but the sounds were more mechanical, like machinery or vehicles running somewhere in the distance. The trail map didn't show any roads or facilities in that direction, so I was curious about what I was hearing. As I continued hiking, the mechanical sounds became more distinct. It sounded like generators or possibly chainsaws, though it was hard to tell exactly because the sound was muffled by the trees and seemed to be coming from a direction that was off the marked trail. I started to notice other things that seemed out of place, tire tracks in areas where vehicles shouldn't be able to access, and what looked like cleared paths leading off into the woods that weren't marked on any map. My curiosity got the better of me. Instead of continuing toward the waterfall, I decided to investigate where these sounds were coming from. I followed one of the cleared paths for about 10 minutes, and that's when I saw something that made my blood run cold. Through the trees ahead, I could see what looked like a large clearing with several structures. Not buildings exactly, but makeshift shelters made from tarps and plywood. There were vehicles parked around the area, including pickup trucks and ATVs, and I could see people moving around between the structures. The mechanical sounds I'd been hearing were coming from generators and other equipment scattered throughout the clearing. I immediately knew I was looking at something illegal. This wasn't an authorized camping area or any kind of legitimate facility. The people I could see were all men, probably ranging from their 20s to their 50s, and they were clearly engaged in some kind of operation that they didn't want discovered by park authorities or other visitors. I crouched behind a large tree and tried to get a better view of what was happening without being seen. There were probably 15 or 20 men in the clearing, and they seemed to be processing something at several different workstations. I could see large containers, what looked like chemical equipment, and tables covered with materials I couldn't identify from that distance. The smell hit me before I fully understood what I was seeing. A harsh, chemical odor that made my eyes water and my throat burn. That's when I realized I was looking at a methamphetamine production operation set up deep in the state park, where they assumed no one would accidentally discover them. I needed to get out of there immediately. These weren't people I wanted to encounter, especially alone in the middle of nowhere with no cell phone service and no way to call for help. I started backing away from the clearing as quietly as possible, trying to retrace my steps to the main trail without making any noise that might attract attention. But as I was retreating through the trees, I stepped on a large branch that snapped with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet forest. I froze, hoping the noise from their generators and equipment had covered it. But within seconds, I could hear voices calling out from the clearing. Did you hear that? Someone shouted. Check the tree line. I didn't wait to see if they were going to investigate. I turned and ran as fast as I could back toward the main trail, not worrying about noise anymore, just focused on getting as much distance as possible between myself and the meth lab. Behind me, I could hear men shouting and what sounded like people crashing through the underbrush. When I reached the main trail, I didn't stop running. I sprinted back toward the trailhead, my heart pounding and my lungs burning, expecting at any moment to hear ATVs or vehicles coming after me. The 3 miles back to the trailhead felt like the longest run of my life. By the time I reached my car at the trailhead parking area, I was exhausted and shaking. I sat in the driver's seat for several minutes, trying to catch my breath and figure out what to do next. I needed to report what I'd seen to law enforcement. But I also needed to get away from the area in case the people from the clearing came looking for whoever had discovered their operation. I drove straight to the park ranger station and told the duty ranger what I'd encountered. He listened to my description and immediately called the county sheriff's department, and what I later learned was a drug enforcement task force. Within an hour, the parking area at the ranger station was full of police vehicles, and I was giving detailed statements to multiple officers about exactly what I'd seen and where. The investigation that followed was extensive and dangerous. Law enforcement had to bring in specialized teams to safely dismantle the meth lab because of the toxic chemicals and booby traps the operators had set up around their perimeter. The operation I'd discovered had been running for over 6 months, producing large quantities of methamphetamine that was being distributed throughout the region. They arrested 12 men at the site, several of whom had outstanding warrants for violent crimes. During the raid, officers found weapons, stolen vehicles, and evidence that the group had been using the remote location, not just for drug manufacturing, but also for storing stolen property and planning other criminal activities. The detective who interviewed me explained that these kinds of operations specifically choose isolated locations in state and national parks because they assume they won't be discovered by casual visitors. The remoteness that makes these areas attractive to hikers and campers also makes them attractive to criminals who need privacy for illegal activities. What disturbed me most was learning how dangerous my situation had actually been. The men operating the meth lab were all armed and had reportedly threatened to kill anyone who might discover their operation. If they'd caught me observing their activities, the outcome could have been fatal. The detective said, "I was lucky that my decision to run immediately had probably saved my life. The incident completely changed how I approach outdoor recreation. I still go hiking and camping, but I'm much more aware of signs that might indicate illegal activity in remote areas. Unusual vehicle tracks, cleared areas not shown on maps, mechanical sounds where they shouldn't be, chemical odors. These are all red flags that suggest it's time to leave immediately." I also learned that reporting suspicious activity in parks is crucial for everyone's safety. Law enforcement agencies rely on visitors to report things that don't seem right because they can't monitor every remote area all the time. My accidental discovery led to the shutdown of a major drug operation and prevented who knows how many people from being harmed by the methamphetamine they were producing. The experience taught me that even activities as innocent as hiking can expose you to serious dangers if you happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The outdoors aren't always the peaceful escape from urban crime that we like to think they are. Criminals use remote areas specifically because most people assume they're safe from human threats when they're surrounded by nature. I still love spending time in parks and forests, but I'm more cautious about exploring off-trail areas and more attentive to signs that might indicate I should leave an area immediately. The solitude and isolation that make outdoor recreation appealing are the same qualities that make these locations attractive to people engaged in dangerous, illegal activities. Most importantly, I learned to trust my instincts when something seems out of place in a natural setting. The mechanical sounds and chemical odors I'd encountered were clear warning signs that something wasn't right, even before I visually confirmed what was happening. Paying attention to those kinds of environmental cues and taking them seriously can be the difference between a pleasant outdoor experience and a life-threatening encounter. Story number 2, I live alone in a small apartment complex on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where most residents keep to themselves and everyone has different work schedules, so you don't really get to know your neighbors very well. It's a quiet building, mostly young professionals and college students, with thin walls and a parking situation that requires some creativity since there aren't quite enough spaces for everyone who lives here. This particular incident happened on a Saturday in November, one of those gray, drizzly days when you don't really want to go outside, but staying inside starts to feel claustrophobic after a while. I'd been dealing with a lot of stress at work, a major project that was behind schedule, a demanding client, and the general pressure that comes with being relatively new at a job where you're still trying to prove yourself. I'd planned to spend Saturday catching up on household chores and maybe doing some meal prep for the upcoming week. Nothing exciting, just the kind of mundane weekend tasks that help you feel like you have some control over your life when everything else feels chaotic. I'd been looking forward to a quiet day at home with no deadlines, no meetings, and no responsibilities beyond taking care of my own space. Around 10 a.m., I was in the kitchen washing dishes when I heard what sounded like arguing coming from the apartment next door. Unit 4B, directly adjacent to mine, with a shared wall between our kitchens. I'd occasionally heard normal sounds from that apartment television, music, footsteps, but never anything that sounded like a serious argument. The voices were muffled through the wall, but I could tell there were at least 2 people, and they were clearly angry about something. I tried to ignore it and continue with my chores, figuring it was none of my business and would probably resolve itself quickly. Couples argue, roommates have disagreements, and apartment living means occasionally overhearing things you'd rather not hear. But the argument escalated. The voices became louder and more aggressive, and I started to hear what sounded like furniture being moved or possibly thrown around. Then I heard a sound that made me stop what I was doing and listen more carefully. A woman screaming, not in anger, but in what sounded like fear or pain. I'd never met my neighbors in 4B, but I knew from seeing mail in the lobby that the apartment was rented to someone named Marcus Williams. I'd occasionally seen a man who I assumed was Marcus coming and going, usually alone, sometimes with different women. He seemed to be in his 30s, average height, and generally kept to himself. The woman's screaming continued, interspersed with a man's voice shouting what sounded like threats. I couldn't make out specific words through the wall, but the tone was unmistakably menacing. Then I heard what sounded like something heavy hitting the wall, followed by a woman crying. I was faced with a dilemma that I think most people struggle with in similar situations. Was this a serious domestic violence situation that required intervention? Or was it an argument between adults that would resolve itself? How could I tell the difference? And if it was serious, what was the appropriate response? I decided to call the non-emergency police line to report a possible domestic disturbance. I explained that I was hearing what sounded like a violent argument from the neighboring apartment, including a woman screaming and sounds that suggested physical violence. The dispatcher took my information and said they would send officers to investigate. The police arrived about 20 minutes later. I watched through my front window as 2 officers approached the building and rang the buzzer for apartment 4B. I couldn't hear their conversation with whoever answered, but after a few minutes, they were allowed into the building and went upstairs. From my apartment, I could hear the officers knocking on the door of 4B and announcing themselves as police. There was a long pause before someone opened the door, and then I could hear the low murmur of conversation, though I couldn't make out what was being said. The officers stayed for about 15 minutes, and during that time, everything was quiet in the neighboring apartment. No more shouting, no more sounds of things being thrown around. When the police left, I heard them talking quietly in the hallway outside my door, but I couldn't understand what they were saying. About an hour after the police visit, I heard a single set of footsteps leaving apartment 4B and going down the stairs. Looking out my window, I saw Marcus Williams getting into his car and driving away. The building was quiet for the rest of the day. I didn't think much more about the incident until Sunday evening, when I was coming home from grocery shopping. As I was walking up the stairs to my apartment, I saw that the door to 4B was slightly open. This seemed odd, since Marcus had left the day before and I hadn't heard him return. I paused on the landing and called out, "Hello. Is everything okay?" There was no response, but I could see that the apartment was dark and appeared to be empty. I approached the door cautiously and pushed it open wider. What I saw inside made me immediately call 911. The apartment was completely trashed, furniture overturned, belongings scattered everywhere, and what looked like blood on the walls and carpet. It was clear that something violent had occurred, and it was much worse than what I'd heard through the wall on Saturday. Police and paramedics arrived within minutes of my call. They secured the scene and began a thorough investigation of the apartment. I gave them a detailed account of what I'd heard on Saturday and explained that I'd called police at that time, but didn't know what had happened during their visit. It took several hours for the full story to emerge from the investigation. The woman I'd heard screaming on Saturday was named Jennifer Martinez. Marcus Williams' ex-girlfriend, who had come to collect some belongings she'd left in his apartment after their breakup. According to neighbors who were eventually interviewed, Marcus had been harassing Jennifer for weeks after she ended their relationship. When police responded to my call on Saturday, they'd spoken with both Marcus and Jennifer. Marcus had claimed they were just having a loud argument about belongings, and Jennifer had apparently been too frightened to contradict his story or ask for help. The officers had no evidence of physical violence and no complaint from the alleged victim, so they documented the incident and left. After the police left on Saturday, Marcus had become enraged that Jennifer had caused trouble by making enough noise for neighbors to call authorities. The physical evidence in the apartment suggested that he had severely beaten her and then forced her to help him clean up the most obvious signs of violence before anyone else might investigate. Jennifer Martinez was found unconscious in a storage unit across town, where Marcus had apparently taken her after the assault. She was alive, but had sustained serious injuries, including a concussion, broken ribs, and internal bleeding. She was hospitalized for over a week and required multiple surgeries. Marcus Williams was arrested at his workplace on Monday morning and charged with kidnapping, aggravated assault, and domestic violence. The investigation revealed that he had a history of violent relationships and had been arrested for domestic violence in 2 previous states before moving to our area. During the trial, Jennifer testified that Marcus had become increasingly controlling and violent during their relationship, which was why she had decided to end it. She said that on Saturday, she had gone to his apartment to collect her belongings with the intention of cutting all contact with him permanently. Marcus had become violent when she refused his demands to reconcile their relationship. The argument I'd overheard through the wall was just the beginning of an assault that had continued for hours after the police visit. Jennifer said she had been too scared to tell the responding officers what was really happening because Marcus had threatened to kill her if she said anything. Marcus Williams was convicted on all charges and sentenced to 15 years in prison. Jennifer Martinez recovered from her physical injuries, but required ongoing counseling for the psychological trauma of the assault and kidnapping. This experience taught me several important lessons about domestic violence and being a responsible neighbor. First, I learned that domestic violence situations are often much more complex and dangerous than they appear from the outside. What sounds like a typical argument between adults can actually be a life-threatening assault. I also learned that calling police about domestic disturbances is always the right choice, even when you're not sure how serious the situation really is. The officers who responded to my first call had followed proper procedures, but domestic violence situations often require multiple interventions before victims feel safe enough to seek help. Most importantly, I learned that domestic violence victims are often unable to ask for help directly, either because they're physically prevented from doing so or because they're too frightened of retaliation from their abusers. Jennifer hadn't been able to tell police what was really happening on Saturday, not because she didn't want help, but because she was terrified of what Marcus would do if she revealed the truth. The incident changed how I think about my responsibilities as a neighbor and community member. I realized that sometimes being willing to make that phone call or knock on someone's door can literally save a life. If I hadn't reported the sounds I heard on Saturday, if I hadn't checked when the door was left open on Sunday, Jennifer might have died from her injuries before anyone discovered what had happened to her. I also learned that domestic violence doesn't always look the way people expect it to. Marcus Williams seemed like a normal guy. He had a regular job, dressed professionally, and was generally quiet and unremarkable. The violence was happening behind closed doors, invisible to most people who encountered him in daily life. Since this incident, I've become more aware of signs that might indicate someone in my building or neighborhood is experiencing domestic violence. Unusual noises, inconsistent stories about injuries, social isolation, signs of fear around particular individuals. These can all be indicators that someone needs help. I've also learned that domestic violence affects people from all backgrounds and circumstances. Jennifer was a college-educated professional who had her own apartment and career. She wasn't economically dependent on Marcus or trapped by circumstances that people typically associate with domestic violence. The violence was about control and power, not about economic or social factors. The experience reinforced my belief that community safety is everyone's responsibility. We can't assume that someone else will report concerning situations or that victims will always be able to ask for help directly. Sometimes being a good neighbor means being willing to get involved when you witness or suspect that someone is being harmed.